Thank you very much for joining us here for a very special conversation on gender parity and the need for gender parity to try and foster the cause of economic recovery. My name is Shireen Bhan, and it gives me great privilege and pleasure to welcome here on this panel a very special set of guests who are going to be talking to us about this very important conversation that we hope to mainstream. I am also going to make this interactive, so it would be nice if you do have questions and comments. I will get to you towards the end of our panel discussion, and we will engage with all of you as participants as well. To contextualize where we stand as far as the gender gap is concerned and why it is so important to have this conversation here in Davos 2023, there have been significant setbacks through the course of the pandemic. On your screen, that is the number that you need to focus on. 151 years to gender parity, that is the number that we need to all focus on, and that is the kind of work that is required to ensure that we bridge the gap, that we bridge the deficits. Why is it important? It's not just the just thing to do. It is not just the fair thing to do. It is the right thing to do because it makes economic sense. It makes business sense. And there are studies, innumerable studies, that highlight the importance of unlocking value by ensuring that women actually have access to credit, women have access to education, women have access to employment. And that is what we hope to address here on the panel today, on why it is important that we actually put fiscal measures in place, monetary measures in place. We involve the private sector to try and ensure that we can bridge this very significant gap. Through the course of this conversation, I will bring up other data points as well, which point us in terms of not just what the diagnosis is of the problem, but also provide a prescription about the road ahead. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to our panelists here today. Let me start from my left. Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning at Nigeria, Zainab Ahmed, thank you very much for joining us. Smriti Irani, the Minister of Women and Child Development representing India. Ms. Irani, thank you very much for joining us. Ilan Goldfajn, the President, Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C., the lone man on the panel. Thank you very much for joining us here as well. And Gabriela Bucher, the Executive Director at Oxfam International, Kenya. Thank you very much, Gabriela, for joining us. I also want to make a note of the fact that CNBC TV 18, of course, we are India's leading news brand. We have started a campaign called the Future Female Forward Initiative. It is a women's collective. We launched this in November, and we hope to mainstream this conversation, not just in India, but take it global, and that is why we're here having this conversation. Minister, let me start by asking you. You talk about the need to unlock the value that women can make, the difference that women can make as far as economic recovery is concerned, economic resilience is concerned. From your experience in Nigeria, in terms of how you are looking at gender budgeting, for instance, what is the way forward? What has been the experience so far?
Well, let me thank the organizers for inviting me, and it's really a privilege to be here. We do realize in government that we have to make deliberate policies and take deliberate actions to make sure that there's more inclusiveness of women in every facet of our society, not just in government, but in every facet of our society. And during the COVID, it became very, very glaring that whether it's the impact of COVID or impact of climate change or economic slowdown, that the most affected people are actually women. So in designing any policy, whether it's fiscal, monetary, or trade, we have to consciously take into account how does this affect women. And we found a way to cause that to happen in Nigeria. First of all, when we were designing the economic sustainability plan to support us during the COVID period, we designed a cluster of programs, and we required that each program should have at least 50% of the beneficiaries to be women. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the targets that was set for every agency of government that was provided with funding to implement the economic sustainability plan. Then in our national budget, we also made a provision to ensure that MDAs consciously look at their programs and projects with the gender lens. So you need to be asking, how can I implement this program in a way that women will benefit, whether it is road construction or economic empowerment. For example, when we developed the social register to be able to provide support to the most vulnerable in the society. We ended up having a situation, even before the COVID, that 92% of the caregivers on our social register that is meant to provide cash transfers to people are women. And also we found out that when we provided small loans to very small businesses, that performance of the loans from the women in terms of recovery is about 99%. Yes. So it just meant to us that taking care of what the women need is actually a very wise economic decision. You're able to get more mileage for whatever limited resources that you have. So we're doing that in every sector of the economy, and we're beginning to see the results. We've designed a monitoring framework that enables agencies of government to report to us with data in a disaggregated format, so we see what the outcomes are of the plans and the funding that we have deployed.
Well, thank you very much for your opening comments, and I think that's a very important point that you make, and it's well articulated. It's not just important and imperative to bank on women. Women are also good to bank with, and I think that is the experience that the financial sector will certainly validate. Minister Irani, let me address that same issue with you. You know, we just heard here from the Minister from Nigeria talking about the need for financial inclusion, access to credit. There are several measures that the Indian government has already put in place, opening bank accounts, for instance, the Mudra scheme, for instance, for the benefit of our participants here and those who are watching. It is a scheme to try and ensure that there is access to credit for women who are looking at creating their own enterprises. How has the journey been so far? But more importantly, as we look ahead, given the context of the setbacks that we have seen through the course of the pandemic and the disproportionate impact it's had on women, what more needs to be done?
Shireen, you began this conversation with a very ominous figure on the wall, which is 151 years needed to bring about parity and economic participation by women. How do you arrive at that number? Which level of economic participation or empowerment do you measure to reach that number? Let me give you an Indian context. We are a billion-plus society, of which 1.35 billion is the population, of which 1.3 billion Indians now have a digital identity, men and women equally so. We are a 700 million literate people, of which 600 million are in the workforce, men and women included. Some in the organized sector, some in the unorganized sector. When you talk about fiscal services, we need to see what did India do pre-pandemic. Because not much can be spoken of post-pandemic or as we've transitioned out of pandemic from a gender perspective, justly without recognizing what happened before the pandemic. Now, in the year 2014, the Prime Minister said that in a billion-plus society, we have close to 400 million people who are unbanked, out of which 220 million were women. The banks reached out for the first time in India. No individual walked up to a bank branch. Banking correspondents reached out to our society at large at zero deposits, opened up bank accounts for 440 million Indians, of which 220 million were women. Now, you speak about Mudra Yojana. It was not a gendered fiscal service. Mudra Yojana was basically a financial service where up to ₹1 million for small industry, cottage industry, that credit support without collateral was proposed by the government. There was no subscription that this would be the agency of only women. Yeah. What surprised people in the fiscal world was that 70% of the 320 million loans given out were taken by women, which means many recognize that at the entry level of enterprise, you have a female talent, which by that time was appearing to be unrecognized. Then we came to a stage where we said, if we want to provide support fiscally for mid-sized companies, the startup regime, should we do this again, not a gendered financial service, but Stand Up India came about. Nobody expected that 80% of the beneficiaries will turn out to be women, which means that in a world which is talking about, especially in Davos, where we speak about skilling, reskilling, this was a latent talent which was unrecognized. Women had the skill sets to draw up a business plan, go to a bank, convince the banking sector of their business potential. And as ministers rightly said, even in India, the NPA is 1% or less, which means when you support the agency of women, what do you support? It makes fiscal sense, it is societally empowering, and it is civilizationally beneficial. Again, I'll go back to the number that you have pronounced here. How does India feature in that gap index? Which part of Indian womanhood is not recognized in that index? You speak about political power. I have 1.4 million women who get elected to office in the grassroots structure of governance, which is our panchayat. These are women who spend money from the Indian treasury on issues which impact not only women's issues, but also society at large, looking at infrastructure, the grassroots, health, education. They don't get recognized in that index. It's as though they don't exist. I have 15 million women today in India who sit in administrative governance positions who don't get recognized by the index. Do they not exist? They very well do. I have 80 million women in India who handle singularly close to $32 billion worth of credit for themselves as a coalition. They skill themselves digitally and physically on many issues. They are a part of a supply chain of craft, of agro-processing. They don't figure there because they are not large industrial houses to sit at tables such as this and say, we matter. We keep the economic wheels turning. So when you put money behind the agency of women, is it only enough to do so fiscally? What are the human development issues on which, if you put that money on infrastructure, particularly supporting women, that it'll have a GDP impact? So again, I turn the clock back to 2014 when the Prime Minister said from the ramparts of the Red Fort, if we speak of gender justice, can we start by building toilets for women? Now, no man in my country, and I'm sure I can speak for many democracies across the world, would ever stand on Independence Day and say, let's build toilets for women. It's not politically glamorous, but my Prime Minister did. We built 110 million individual household toilets for women. Now, if you look at the fiscal impact, in 2013, the World Bank report said that due to the lack of sanitation facilities, there is a negative 6% impact on our GDP. So while this looked like a pronounced intervention for women's health and sanitation, it had an impact on the economy as a whole. So I think that if we are looking at the cause of women to be served, we need to recognize, and we have set an example in India, that it cannot be siloed, only fiscal, only academic, only skill. It has to be a holistic enterprise. Governance, policymakers, private sector, all have to come together. It is not a path of revolution that can be walked singularly.
Mr. Goldfajn, picking up from what Minister Irani said, and of course she's also questioned the metrics that are used to come up with the gender parity survey that the World Economic Forum puts out. I want to understand from you about the civilizational impact, the economic impact that emancipating women brings to the table. The work that you are doing, for instance, as an agency at this point in time, take me through the empirical evidence that suggests that if you put more fiscal and monetary might to address this issue, we are going to be able to see multiplier impact.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I think it's an honor. It's a pleasure to be here. There are quite a few initiatives for development banks, all the financing linked to indicators, when you give financing to governments, to local governments, even to the private sector, they are linked to gender gaps and good practices. There are also initiatives of putting businesses and societies and governments together in platforms. We have a platform called Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiatives. There are also the accelerators with the World Economic Forum. There's also financing new innovations. For example, we're working with Laboratoria, which is a social entrepreneurship initiatives that train women to get digital skills. So all of this is part of the effort. But you are asking me something which is more, I will say, economy-wide. What is the impact of not having the gender parity in terms of growth and in terms of resilience, which is quite important. I will say at least from the region we are coming, there are three very important impacts. First, we know that women represent 60% of university graduates in Latin America. But we are not using this talent in the labor market for several reasons. So if we were able to use that to reduce the gap, you could be able to generate more growth, more productivity, just because you're putting in the labor market more talent that you're not using. That's the first one. The second is that we are getting old in the region. Latin America will become old, not so far away, and we will be having more people retiring than working. So if we are not able to put a very important part of the population, female part, into the labor market, this lower worker participation will get worse. So that's the second reason why it affects growth. The third one, which is very Latin America, informality. If there's a gender gap in informality in the sense that we have more females in the informal sector. And the informal sector have two problems. One, it's less resilient, because if you have a pandemic and you need to have public services, you don't get to them. And also, we also know that in the informal sector, productivity is lower. And this is informality has been very pervasive in Latin America. So what we can do? Well, you'll say, well, let's use fiscal tools. What does it mean, fiscal tools? Usually when you have income gaps or other gaps, you use the tax system to do it. But in the informal sector, you're not going to reach them because they're not formally, the tax system cannot really reach them. So what can we do? There are ways to try to be transparent. And we mentioned here about gender budgeting, which is basically, the way I understand it, is being very transparent and open and see the gender gap in all the fiscal measures, both the services you provide, the subsidies you give, the sectors you finance. See what are you doing in terms of gender from your fiscal policy. And there are a lot of things you can do. You can allocate spending to either services that reach women in a direct way, like healthcare, or you can finance sectors, service sectors, where you have more female participation. So there are things you can do from a macro perspective, even though you don't use the tax system. Or, for example, you can use other indicators, which is having in public procurement, buy from those suppliers that have a better practice in terms of gender. So all of this is part of the toolkit, macro toolkit, that you can use even though you have to reach a more informal sector.
I think that's a very valid point that you make, that very often the participation of women is on the informal side. That's not captured, and that also makes it harder for them to be able to access the financial system. And of course, the toolkit that you spoke of, in many parts of the world, in different ways, shapes and forms, that toolkit is being used. Gabriela, I want to understand from you, you believe that the impact of the pandemic on gender parity and gender inequality has been profound and staggering, but you also believe that it is not an inevitable issue, that it is an issue that can be fixed. Now, outside of some of the fiscal measures that you spoke of, and I know that Oxfam is asking for higher taxes, tax the rich, to be able to finance some of these goals that we spoke of, what is the roadmap that you want us to take forward? Thank you. So good questions, and I would like to build on what the other panelists have said and go back to the 151 years, because as was said, you know, this is a figure, a target that we have, but it's in fact sliding back instead of going forward. And the pandemic hit a very unequal world, unequal in so many ways, economically, socially, gender unequal. And it hit women disproportionately. And so we know on issues like education, of course, there was already a huge education gap between boys and girls. But unfortunately, in the crisis moment, more girls were pushed out of education. So that's not only an issue for the present, but for the long-term future. So it's not just, as we were saying earlier, an issue of their rights, but also of their future economic contribution. So that's a big concern. Also, women lost many more jobs than men for multiple reasons, and young women lost twice the amount of jobs that young men lost. So that, again, is long-term. And there are issues like, Ilan was talking about the 60% graduate number in Latin America. Why is it that then they're not represented in the job market? And there's, of course, the point that we haven't talked so much about is women's work in unpaid care work. There's unpaid and paid care work, and that is central to our economies, and it was central to our economies before the pandemic, but it became much more visible. This very invisible work became more visible, and it's the reason behind many of these trends that we're now seeing. And it's something that is not recognized in, for example, we measure a country's GDP, so care is silently a motor behind that we need to make more central. And something else that happened, so after the pandemic, we've had all the shocks that we all know about, and we have a huge debt crisis around the world. So countries have very tight fiscal spaces, very little maneuvering in order to invest in what matters. Health would be a priority after what we've lived through, but on average, countries are spending $1 in health versus $4 in debt repayments. So that is the situation of very difficult choices. And if we don't look at it more holistically as a system problem, we're not going to address it by initiatives here and there. So we think we do have an economic system that is predicated on benefiting the few. And the reason we talk about taxation of wealth, as you're saying, and the report we launched yesterday, is because in reality the tax system has been shifting over the last 40 years to be on the shoulders of workers and on the average citizen who buys products and services, so VAT. And wealth is not taxed in the majority of contexts, so only 4 cents in every dollar of taxation comes from wealth. And this change in taxation mix is actually a very feminist concept, because in reality, most of the billionaires, if you see, are mostly white men. And that's actually the system that is both patriarchal, neo-colonial, and that perpetuates these inequalities, continues to perpetuate this. And so if we change this tax mix, the women on the other side are more represented in poverty, unfortunately. So we need to address this by looking at the sources of funding, the budget that is going to allow us to invest in what matters more to women. And there, the care economy is fundamental, education, health, and that will be the basis for more equal participation.